Hey there everyone! Before we get started, I want to apologize for the clickbaity title. I tried coming up with something different, but to be honest, everything I came up with kind of sounded that way, so I just picked one and went with it. With that out of the way, I wanted to talk a bit about Superman. I've noticed for some time now that there's a bit of a division when it comes to people's feelings towards him. While all superheroes, and indeed all characters anywhere, will have those who like or dislike them to varying degrees, it seems more often than usual that when people don't like the Man of Steel, they really don't like him. And usually the reasons are similar. He's too overpowered, he's too much of a goody-goody, he's too one-dimensional. In short, he's boring. Yet despite those traits, which are hard to deny, I like him nonetheless, and I have a few specific reasons for doing so. Though admittedly, these are reasons I see for myself, and to my knowledge haven't been necessarily shown to us. The first thing that usually comes to mind when it comes to not liking Supes is that he's way too strong. While comic book characters are known for being more powerful than any average person, the DC universe is filled with what I like to consider realistically powerful heroes. Sure, there are your cosmic-based beings such as Green Lantern and Martian Manhunter who may have tremendous energy, but even they tend to exhibit powers and abilities on a relatively mild scale, and their limits can easily be reached in a fierce battle. Even those heroes and villains who seem to possess extreme power, such as Flash or Doomsday, have an obvious flaw, which is that they're limited as to how they use their power. Sure, Flash can do several creative things with the Speed Force, but in the end, speed is his only tool. But in this world, you have Superman. Flight at incredible speeds, super strength, heat vision, cold breath, intelligence, though this seems to be overshadowed whenever Batman is around. And on top of that, it seems he may actually be immortal. Heck, he can even throw a cellophane S at his enemies and mildly annoy them. I'm never letting that go. All of this adds up to a character who seems to have no rivals, and yeah, that's boring. So here we have a character with seemingly no equal. He could do whatever he wanted, and only those few who know his weakness have the ability to stop him. So what does he do with all that power? Good things, and only good things. To be clear, the issue doesn't seem to be that he chooses to be a hero. It's that there almost never seems to be any consideration to anything else. It's difficult to picture him committing heinous acts for his own self-interest or gains, but it's also difficult to imagine him even thinking about doing so. Even in the stories when he's quote-unquote out of control, it's usually because he's dishing out what he believes is justice, with the problem being that he's taking it too far. Again, this kind of behavior is boring for a reader. In a basic story, there should be a setup, the introduction of a conflict, and the resolution of that conflict. And if that's all you have, it's exactly that. Basic. The easiest and often best way to add to this is character depth. Introducing us to the internal struggles a hero might be going through, understanding their motives, even teasing the idea of them doing something completely unexpected. These are ways of expanding the storytelling beyond Acts 1, 2, and 3. All of that gets shot down when the reader knows for certain that the hero is going to save the day, and that he or she is going to do it because it's morally the right thing to do. This lack of moral questionability, combined with strength that is for all intents and purposes limitless, creates an absence of what we would call growth. He doesn't change because, well, he doesn't really have to. Why do you need to change and adapt to the world around you when you can punch any troubles away and feel 100% right for doing so every time? It takes away the last opportunity for depth in a character and leaves us with the same person we started with. Every time. Always. It would even be acceptable if he teetered back and forth between the idea of changing who he is and then deciding against it. But even if they tried to hint at that, we'd know it was never going to happen. And here comes that word again, but yeah, that's boring. In the end, we're left with nothing that could be unique to Superman. We could replace him with generic hero A and the stories would play out exactly the same. So why bother with him at all? Well, like I said before, I still like Superman as a character and as a hero. And since I suspect his fans are about ready to kill me, or at least click dislike, let me get into why. And it starts with Clark Kent. By now we've all heard the idea that Clark Kent is Superman's way of blending in with society, with the insinuation being that he sees us as weaklings. I disagree with this as an evaluation of humanity. The fact that Superman chooses to portray Clark Kent as weak is obviously a ruse to throw off any suspicions about him being Superman. We always say that people are fooled by him simply by putting on glasses, but think about it. In order to see Superman and Clark Kent, they need to see past the slouching, the uncoordination and klutziness, the timidity and lack of courage, the flakiness, and yeah, the glasses too. This is the image he perpetuates in order to disguise himself, and make no mistake, it is a disguise. Which means that every day he leaves the house, he has to hide who he really is in order to fit in. As geeks, I'm willing to bet more than a few of you listening to this know a little about that. For most of us, our hobbies aren't exactly culturally accepted. Oh yeah, geek culture has certainly gone mainstream, but honestly, how many of us still notice that judgmental look or tone of voice when we express our love of comics or video games or sci-fi to people outside those fan bases? How many of us have heard, even from our own family members, that one day we'll outgrow all this, implying that what we love is for children? It's frustrating, annoying, and even depressing, and the older geeks will know it used to be much worse than today. The easiest way to deal with this struggle is simple. Just hide it. We fake who we are on the outside and hide who we are on the inside because it's easier and in some extreme cases safer to live that way. It's a defense mechanism, and whenever I see people doing it, it makes me sad to know that they must feel trapped in their own life. And that's what Clark Kent is. He's the person we all are on the outside because Superman being who he truly is in public is just, well, too much work. In a way, it endears me to him. When I see him act weak through a situation he could easily handle, I remember those moments where people misspoke, but I stayed silent because I'd be the nerdy know-it-all or the jerk that corrects people. Or I think about the times I've heard people discuss Star Wars or Star Trek, but I could tell that they were more casual fans, so if I joined them with my passionate opinions, I'd get that look I mentioned earlier. It's personal, and that gives the character depth to me, and it must be harder for someone like him to balance that dual personality with the other burdens he faces. With great power comes great responsibility. Uncle Ben may have been a Marvel character, but that message resonates anywhere and everywhere. It would also stand to reason that with greater power comes greater responsibility. That could easily mean that Superman, the man with what some consider to be the greatest power, may also be weighed down with the greatest responsibility. While all heroes will answer the call to save their world, and even other worlds if need be, they rarely need to do so. Most heroes have cities or regions they protect, but not many claim the entire world as their responsibility. It's true that Superman tends to be based in Metropolis, but given how often he travels away from there, it could easily be argued that he sees the planet itself as his to protect. He often refers to his home as the Earth, not just Metropolis or Kansas or even the Fortress of Solitude. That kind of stress must be difficult to live with, and even harder to work with. I get stressed when I'm at work and I'm given extra responsibilities, and the worst consequences I'll have to face is that I'll need to finish them the next day. I feel like we don't hear enough about what it must be like to live every day believing that when the world is in danger, he'll have to fight. And not because he wants to, but because, depending on the severity of the threat, he may not have a choice. And when does all this end for him? Well, like I mentioned before, it might never end because for all he knows, he might be immortal. Yes, we have stories of him both dying or living for extended periods of time, but from his perspective, he doesn't see that. All he sees is a life of struggle that may never end. Take a minute to imagine that. Imagine a day at work when things fell apart and you needed to be the one to pick up the pieces. What if someone told you that that workday was never going to end? How would you feel? Would you try harder or would you give up? And how many times over the course of that day would you reevaluate that decision? Again, this is something I'd like to see addressed in some way, but even though it's not, I believe it's there. I feel like bringing it out would create more understanding in his motivations and in turn help us to see a much more relatable character. To be fair, too much of that could get annoying, but just giving the reader a little bit of insight into this side of him would give him a lot more dimension and feel, you guessed it, a lot less boring. That's my opinion anyway, and honestly, it wasn't always. I used to be one of the people who disliked Superman stories, and for all those reasons I mentioned. I never disliked the character though, and when I really thought about him, I figured out why. He has the potential to be a very deep character, and I see that in him, even though we don't often get to see that in the stories we read. Personally, just once, I'd love to read a novel about Superman without a villain, where the conflict isn't a monster or a disaster, but him realizing that the monsters and the disasters will always be there, and it will always be his job to handle them. Maybe a chronicle of his thoughts throughout the years, a sort of Superman's journal. I think it would help people see him differently, or at least be open to the idea. Because after all these years, we've seen so much of the super, yet so little of the man. I'd like to thank you all for listening to what was an unusually long chat from me. Let me know what you think about Superman and whether or not you find him boring. I should probably say that this video isn't about trying to sway anyone from disliking him or anything. I just wanted to share my thoughts on the character and why, despite people not finding him interesting overall, there may be some aspects of him you never considered. If you still don't find him engaging, that's totally okay. Either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, let me know if there are any books out there that may offer me the kind of insights I mentioned in this talk. I haven't read it all, so I'd love to read more. Take care, everyone, and have a great night.